I will start by saying we are living in the era of disruption. I think we feel that, many of us know that, and perhaps there is no more critical issue in the era of disruption than being agile. And organizations today need to be incredibly agile to flex and respond to an operating environment that is changing on an ongoing, every moment basis. In fact, I just read a study yesterday from Korn Ferry that says that strategic agility is, in fact, the number one priority of numerous CEOs that they had recently conducted a study on. I guess to start this presentation, I can't think of a more fitting way than to use a quote from John Chambers from Cisco, who said that in today's world, in the era of disruption that we live in today, if we don't transform, if we don't reinvent ourselves and change our organizations, we will be disrupted. And he goes on to say, and it will be a brutal disruption where the majority of companies will not exist in a meaningful way in the next 10 to 15 years. So that's a very strong statement. And it's something that many of us feel and see on a day-to-day basis. In some cases, it may be off into the distance. In other cases, it may be in our faces, in the moment, something we are confronting and dealing with. But to back that statement up, you only need to look at the S&P 500 index. You only need to look at, since its inception, the average lifespan of an S&P 500 company, as many of us have heard before, has decreased fourfold, to the point where today, the average life expectancy is somewhere around 15 years and declining, projected to decline. So when you play that forward, essentially what that says is, and the University of Washington study looked at this in much more detail than what I will here, but essentially what that says is in the next decade, at least 40% of the current S&P 500 companies will not exist in the same nature that they do today. To, again, back up John Chambers' quote and comment. So this is something that I have been fascinated by. This is something that I have studied now for years and have most recently written about in regards to, okay, if that's the reality, then what do we do? How do we proceed forward? Well, it turns out that most organizations still stubbornly cling to outdated models, still stubbornly cling to approaches from not this century, not even last century, but perhaps 2 centuries ago. And I love this quote. This really sort of highlights and emphasizes the point that I'm trying to make, which is we've got 21st century technology, speed, and norms, beliefs colliding head on with 20th century and even 19th century institutions, rules, and culture. So we need to look at organizations differently today. We need to think about the era of disruption and whether or not our organizations are capable of responding in an agile manner and adapting in response to the disruptions that surround us on a day-to-day basis. We at General Motors have come face to face with this. Mary Barra said a few years ago that the automotive industry will change more in the next 5 years than it has in the last 50. I believe that that's already a true statement, even though she made that quote 3 years ago. And you feel it, because, Uber was barely in existence 5 years ago. Tesla was only beginning to, conceive of, their future possibilities. And now we've got Waymo entering into the self-driving vehicle space. All 3 non-traditional competitors, all 3 organizations, and that list goes on and on and on as we go across the globe and look at what's happening in China, look at what's happening throughout Europe, look at what's happening in Israel as we start to think about the future of mobility and the numerous entrants that don't even originate from the automotive space. So that leaves us with a big challenge. And this is where, I have been studying for the last decade. And that is, why is it that some organizations are adaptive and others are not? Why is it that some organizations can look at these threats, confront them and look at them as an opportunity to catapult forward into new markets, new opportunities, And yet other organizations stubbornly cling to ways of doing things in the past and truly do become disrupted. So I think that leaves us with a choice. We can either be the disruptors or we can be disrupted, in the world that we live in today. And that's what I want to spend some time talking about. But it all is grounded in about a decade and a half worth of research on that one fundamental question. Why is it that some organizations are adaptive and others are not? So to answer that question, a small research team that I was part of, an academic research team that I was part of, actually went out and looked at 60 complex, large organizations across such areas, such services as financial services, aerospace, technology, automotive, healthcare, et cetera, and interviewed over 500 leaders in a very comprehensive manner, also conducting numerous organizational network analyses to answer that core question. Why is it that some organizations are adaptive and others aren't? What we found was even a surprise to us. Originally, there were some very obvious things. Every organization had what we call an operational system. Those are the formal systems to get stuff done. These are the approaches to scale, to formalize, to really, formally endorse ideas and, deliver results on an ongoing routine basis. That is as important today as it's ever been. That pays the bills. We were also, in some cases surprised to find out that every organization had great ideas. We ended up calling these entrepreneurial pockets. These are the, individuals deep inside of an organization, sometimes, deep inside an organization's hierarchy, sometimes very high up in the hierarchy, who are the people formulating new ideas, the people who are really trying to reinvent and consider what the future set of outcomes could look like. Every single organization had these, and we were somewhat surprised to find that. It was only the adaptive organizations that had this third dimension. And the third dimension is what we have since labeled adaptive space. Adaptive space, quite simply, and I'll expand upon this later, can be thought of as a bridge that takes these, ideas deep inside the organization or spread throughout the organization in these entrepreneurial pockets, sometimes formally, sometimes informally, and pulls them through into the operational system. I promise this will be my only theory chart, but the bottom line is, if you don't have that bridge, if you don't have the ability to pull ideas from within the organization, and then even sometimes from outside the organization, and pull them into these formal systems, you can't scale them. And this is why we know of many organizations that didn't only predict their own demise, but they invented it. And we could go on and on through the list of companies like Kodak that created and designed and literally invented the very thing that ushered in their own demise over the long haul. So this is what we've seen in the organizations that were adaptive. In the subset of in a subset of the 60 organizations we looked at, some of them, and you would know their names, you would think of them as adaptive, had this adaptive space, and they were able to routinely, on an ongoing basis, pull these ideas out of these pockets into the operational system. What surprised us even more than that was the fact that we believe this is social. None of us, when we started out on this path a decade and a half ago, were what I would consider to be network experts. But as we delved deeper and deeper into this, a couple really interesting things struck us. One was, for the successes, as we were following and tracking through successes in the organization, one of the things that surprised us was every time we would talk to someone about a success, they would give us 3 more names of people that we should go talk to. We would go talk to those 3, and they would each give us another 3 names. But something remarkable happened when we asked the second question. Can you tell us about an idea you liked as much, if not more, than that original idea that was a success, but it never saw the light of day? And what would happen in those scenarios is we would go talk to the individual's name they would give us, and that person would go into what I now describe as system rage. They would start screaming and venting to us as interviewers around why the system, why the organization, why their leader wouldn't consider their idea, why, in fact, the rest of the people inside the organization were idiots, and why, in fact, they had the best, most brilliant idea, but nobody else got it. Nobody else endorsed it. Nobody else understood it. And it dawned upon us that the successful ideas seem to have this social dynamic spreading around them, while these less than successful ideas seem to always stop with the lone inventor, the lone creator, maybe two, maybe three max. And we began to study this then from a different lens. That lens being social, that lens being what would it look like if in fact we mapped this and looked at this in a social context. And that's what this next illustration highlights. So here's an organization. This is an organizational network analysis for a large financial services company, or at least a subset of that financial services company, that had just acquired a smaller, more entrepreneurial company. The larger companies represented by the red pink dots here, while the blue dots are the smaller acquired organization. And they acquired this company because they wanted their entrepreneurial spirit. They wanted to pull their inventions, their creations, their innovation into the core of this more mechanistic organization so that they can unleash new possibilities. But just a few months in, this is what we saw. The only people, in fact, that were even connected to one another between these two entities at this stage was, in fact, the integration team. These people inside this blue bubble here were the people that were formally, given the task, the role of integrating these two teams. So very quickly, very early on, this was a disastrous marriage for the smaller company. You can imagine what would happen. They felt rejected. They felt like they were being squelched. They felt like they were being consumed by this larger entity. And in fact, they tried to stay away as long as they could. But then by mistake, not necessarily by design, this is what happened. Across the next few months, people from inside the smaller entity, who just happened to be also phenomenal leaders, started to get pulled into the core of the other organization. Simply because they were great leaders, they ended up taking on different roles inside the other organization for the more traditional part of the organization. And what they brought along with them was their connections. And what they also brought along with them, and this was the big surprise for us after we went back and looked at this, was in fact the ability to bring new innovations inside the organization. And this is what we now call adaptive space, being able to formulate these connections, which I'll go into much more detail here in a few moments. So another story. This was a medical device facility. The small set of white dots in the center of this particular organization, spread by numerous divisions and numerous departments represented by the Keller dots on the outside, was in fact a core centralized innovation team. In this case, this was a homegrown organic innovation group, numerous PhDs, design thinkers, who across a 3-year time horizon had done some tremendous research and have built some wonderful concepts and prototypes, only to see a success rate of 0 from a commercial marketable standpoint. So across a 3-year time frame, their commercial hit rate was 0. So much like any organizational resource, that's a wasted set of entities, and we cannot let that exist inside of a corporation. So they did what probably everybody on the phone would have done, and our corporations would have done, and they simply diffused them. They could have let them go, but these were highly skilled individuals. What they ended up deciding to do, was simply to disband and decentralize this particular entity. Then something amazing happened. Over the next year, all of a sudden, the very same ideas that were centralized and being pushed out into these groups began to pop throughout the organization. And in both of these cases, and I've got numerous other stories that we didn't map, we were able to identify illustrations of where innovation emerged based on the sets of connections, that existed throughout an organization. So here's my metaphor for this. We as organizations are made up of, to be agile, we as organizations need to be made up of freightliners and speedboats. The freightliners are essential to us, and they won't go away anytime soon because they drive scale, they drive efficiency, they drive operational excellence inside of organizations. But the speedboats, which usually reside somewhere on the edges of the core of the freightliner, are equally as essential in today's world. They can move fast, they can maneuver, they can, zip through the turbulent waters and discover. But here's the thing that we need to get more intentional about. We need to think about these speedboats as our big growth bets. We need to think about, first of all, how do we connect these, what are somewhat disparate speedboats inside of organizations, and how do we create a connective tissue that's necessary in order to enable these things to be more bold than they are today. But just as importantly, if not more, we can no longer leave these two entities completely separated from one another. We can partition these speedboats off, these growth bets off inside of an organization, but at some point they need to become the new core. And in order for them to become the new core, we need to keep them at least loosely connected to the Freightliners. And we need to keep them somewhat connected so that whenever they do grow in scale and concept, we're able to pull them back in such a way that they can, in fact, become the new core. Back to my earlier model diagram, the Freightliner is, in fact, the operational system. It is necessary, and it is the real benefit that large corporations have today in that they can scale quickly. Once you've got alignment, and once you've got dedication around the next big bet, these Freightliners are phenomenal at scale, and this is a disadvantage for startups. While the startups, also have an advantage or do have a distinct advantage in speed, iteration, experimentation, and they can very much act as speedboats. And what we have been playing around with, first in the model and the research that we've conducted, and since in a case study that I will share in a few moments with General Motors, is connecting these core bets with these, connecting these growth bets with the core entity in order to create what we call adaptive space. Adaptive space, quite simply, can be thought of as the relational and emotional freedom for people to explore, exchange, and debate ideas on an ongoing basis. It's kind of like a free trade zone where we're creating intentional connections for people to be able to discover, develop, and diffuse ideas in a very radical fashion. Now, that may sound simple, but the reality is, all new ideas are introduced with conflict. All new ideas add some level of conflict into an organization. And most of us, not most, 95% of us are predisposed to avoid conflict. So you've got to create mechanisms and approaches and frameworks to be able to create different configurations for organizations to work differently. So with that said, let's look at it again on the network. So here's an organizational network diagram. And if you think about it this way, you've got the core in these purple dots, and now you've got the speedboats in these clusters on the outside. Well, what we know about network, studies and research over decades of research from people like Rob Cross and Ron Burt and Wayne Baker and many other experts who've studied this inside corporations is that there are some distinct advantages to these network structures. One is these bridge connections, these people that are what we call brokers, are very much predisposed to innovative ideas and insights. They're very much predisposed to being able to have early access to novel information and diverse sets of information that make them far more innovative. And in fact, some research has been conducted that say that these people are more likely, up to 25% more likely, to discover new insights and breakthrough ideas because of where they sit. But that's not enough. Discovery is only part of the equation. You also have to bring these things into the world. And these small teams on the outside, Amazon calls them two pizza teams, but these small clusters of activities, the speedboats, in fact, are super fast. And the research suggests, some of Sandy Pentland's research up at the MIT Media Lab suggests that these small entities can move up to 20% faster than what the core is capable of moving. So if you want discovery, you want these bridge connections. If you want speed, what you end up wanting are these small subgroups on the edges. This is what I describe often as agility on the edges. But that's not enough. What you also need is a tight core in order to get these ideas pulled back in to the organization, to the core organization, so that they can quickly be scaled and diffused. And that's where this tight core of purple dots works best. And if I put this now into 4 sets of social arrangements, it's really quite simple. The first thing you need in order to be agile in today's complex world is discovery. You need discovery connections where you have bridge ties where people can have access to new, novel information. And you either have brokers to do that, or you do things like design thinking that opens up pathways to consumers and or other latent potential that you can pull back into the organization. But that's not enough, because what we know is ideas are cheap. Ideas that aren't implemented are useless. So you've got to bring them into the world. And the best way to do that is to create these small, cohesive sets of 2 pizza teams to where people can rapidly iterate, test, experiment, and bring new things into the world in such a way that they can stand them up in the local environment and actually manifest them into real solutions and products and services. And they're not just concepts in somebody's mind. But that's not enough, because what we know is in these small pockets, if you're not thoughtful about the next set of connections, that ideas are 43% more likely to be rejected by the broader organization. Reality is we describe this as the not created here mindset. So you need to have a third set of connections, which we call diffusion connections. And this is basically where people can pick up the ideas from these small pockets, these 2 pizza teams, through both brokerage and energy, and diffuse them into the organization. So Rob Cross has done some phenomenal work on what he describes as energizers, and energizers have a 3x lift on other people's ideas. In other words, they're very good at taking your idea and sharing it and promoting it to the broader organization in such a way that it will amplify out and across the broader organization. That's phenomenal for diffusion. And finally, the final move, the final what I call social arrangement, is to in fact create a set of disruptions that actually provides the rampway to get the speedboats back into the supertanker. And if you don't actually break down some of the brick walls that do in fact exist inside of organizations, which requires a different set of connections, then you're not able to actually usher in these new growth bets and in fact create the new normal with a new set of possibilities and ideas. So in summary, it's these 4 social arrangements that make up what we call adaptive space. And in the book, I go into much more detail about each of these, and I want to spend a little bit of time, skipping across each of them. But I want to do it through real stories, and I want to do it first through stories, that we are all aware of, and then I want to use it as an illustration of a case study of how we have done this within General Motors. So first of all, we all know this guy. And when we think of Steve Jobs, and if I were to ask you to describe Steve Jobs, you would say things like innovative, strategically brilliant, super intuitive, a man before his time. Some of you might even say tough, critical, a tough person to work with. And each of those descriptions, and every time I go through this activity, I ask people to describe them, are what we would describe as human capital characteristics. Those are all traits of Steve Jobs' leadership abilities or characteristics. Those are all important, and I believe each of them to be true based on everything that we have read and those who've interacted or did interact with Steve Jobs. But I want to share a different part of the story for you. And I want to pivot away from social capital, which is very necessary, but yet insufficient when it comes to agility. And I want to talk about Steve Jobs' network. And if you look at Steve Jobs' network, and this is his actual network of patents filed, across time, and this actually is a snapshot in 2012. And what you begin to see here is Steve Jobs in the center of this network right here, where my mouse is pointing. That is Steve Jobs. And around him are an array of individuals from within Apple that also filed patents with him or with others inside the corporation. And the very first thing you'll notice is Steve Jobs is not the most connected person inside of Apple in 2012, but he is the most central when it comes to, the different groups that he is connected to. So by the very nature of this network description, Steve Jobs is a broker. Steve Jobs is perfectly positioned to discover in this model. Now, we also know, although we don't have his network, that this was true of him outside the organization. So he did not only have discovery connections inside of Apple, he also had them outside. And that perfectly positioned him to do three really significant things. I've already said he had early access to new information. He also had access to diverse sets of information across these different groups. And then perhaps most importantly, he had the control over the diffusion of those ideas and could actually figure out how to position these ideas to get them deployed and diffused throughout the organization. So that is, in fact, what we want for discovery. But not always do you need to go find the brokers to create discovery. You could also use things like design thinking. So this is a real story. This is a General Motors story where we were interested in what was happening inside of urban environments, city dwellers, we called them, and we were interested in reimagining personal transportation. Specifically, we went and interviewed, these are real folks that we interviewed, Anne and Susan in this particular picture, which were twins, who we met, out in San Francisco. And for a variety of reasons, they did not only did they not own a car, but for a variety of reasons, we found that people like Anne and Susan don't want to, can't own, or won't drive. But they still had a challenge. They still needed to get from point A to point B. So we sell lots of trucks in the center of the country. Getting into the cities and creating these discovery connections by going out and actually discovering what Anne and Susan and other people like them are asking for and want, actually creates as a conduit of discovery for us. From this particular visit, along with many others in this case, came a network of discovery and also a new product that we launched, that was a seamless way for people to have access to vehicles that move them to and from and throughout a city. And we call that product Maven. And Maven is an app-based program that basically is a micro rental system, if you want to think about it that way, or at least started that way, that was launched to solve Anne and Susan's problem and basically created a fleet of vehicles within any given city across North America, and since has been scaled globally. We scaled to 17 cities in the first year to solve this problem. And this product has now become a platform that is really ushered in 4 or 5 new services that have challenged the way that we think about mobility in the future, and especially mobility into an urban environment. But you can also do this inside of corporations. As Madeline said on the front end, we launched something called GM 2020 a few years ago, where we're actually doing discovery within the organization. And this is bottoms up, emergent, almost an organic movement where we bring people together into these large summit environments. We share different things that we're working on, but most importantly, we create connections to where they can share and discover and exchange ideas and then ultimately debate those ideas so that they can go back to their own work environments and positively disrupt the way they work. My favorite picture here is the bottom center picture, where people are shopping their ideas. They're standing up on tables. There are, I think, 350 people inside this old design space of ours. And these are people that are literally marketing their ideas live. If I had the video, you could see people standing up on tables screaming and trying to attract other people to their idea as they're exchanging and then later debating these ideas so that they can bring them back to their local environment and begin to institute change. So those are 3 examples, one in a story that we all know day to day, one in a way to go out externally and discover, and one in which we can specifically create internal discovery connections. And at the end of the day, 3 things you could do is to facilitate discovery is use discovery activities like design thinking, like empathy, and many other techniques that you can use in order to create these discovery connections, partnerships with universities, partnerships with incubators and accelerators, but then intentionally place brokers in the position that they're discovering, they're scouting, they're looking for new ideas, and they're pulling these ideas back into the organization. But then, much like the final story here, building internal and external bridges across these pockets, these entrepreneurial pockets you heard me talk about before, so that in fact people can, share those ideas and iterate on those ideas on an ongoing basis. But as I said before, ideas are cheap. You've got to bring them into the world. And we know this guy is the brilliant inventor of the light bulb. And we could all tell stories about the 10,000 different iterations or different ways not to create a sustainable, commercially successful light bulb from Thomas Edison's story. But very few of us know the second part of the story. And that is the group of muckers that actually did the work. The group of muckers that actually tested, the 3,000 different filaments in a very short time frame after Thomas Edison stood up and declared to the world that he was going to have a commercial light bulb. These muckers, this cohesive band of experimenters that lived inside Menlo Labs, these, what was later called the Invention Lab, the Invention Factory, that created over 400 patents in less than a decade and created brilliant types of innovation, inventions, including the light bulb, were the real fabric, this cohesive band of two pizza individuals that were testing, iterating, and looking at all these different ideas are the real magic that took place at Menlo Park. These were the people that represented glass blowers and mechanics and experts in electric systems that actually helped to work together and sometimes clashed with each other in designing and developing these inventions. Within Thomas Edison, on the other hand, was the central connector that kept these people glued together. Amazon calls these two pizza teams. These are small, nimble, single-purpose teams that work and are highly decoupled from other teams, and they work with one another in such a way that they iterate fast. And the simple rule of a two pizza team is really basic. It basically means that you can maintain very cohesive relationships with people as long as you can feed them all with two pizzas or less. And the whole concept there is let's keep them tight and nimble so that they can move fast like these speedboats. This is what it looks like on the network. Small, nimble teams clustered together, but connected in the center in such a way that you can iterate fastly. And this is a phenomenal way to invent the future, much like Thomas Edison taught us many, many years ago. This is also how we are ushering in self-driving vehicles. This is a network from Cruise Automation. This is our self-driving vehicle, network or self-driving vehicle organization out in San Francisco. And by designing this way, this particular organization has been able to create four different generations of technology in less than 2 years. And they did that through rapid iteration and experimentation, building out models, creating the algorithms, and leveraging the machine learning capability as they collect data to be able to do this quickly. The reason that has to happen this way is because no one has ever created a self-driving vehicle at the levels of safety that are mandated in the world today, and as quickly as needs to be done. And this design is phenomenal at creating those speed networks. Here's a comparison real quickly of that design, and I won't go into the statistics on it, and a more typical design. The design on the left is fast, nimble, small, single-threaded two pizza teams that get connected together. And the more typical development organization looks like the one on the right. Many people scattered across many projects, working on many different things, hedging their bets. And that is fine if you don't need to move fast. But the reality is the network on the left-hand side is far faster at helping to create and co-create the future in an iterative manner. These are what we know as Scrum teams and rapid agile development teams. And there's a very simple way of being able to design them. And you can bring those in through interventions as well. They don't always have to be designs. You can, create things like collabs, which are for us 24-hour hackathons, where we bring people together and give them challenges, put them in small teams, and challenge them to compete against each other in a Shark Tank-like pitch in less than 24 hours from the time that a challenge was initiated for some degree of support. to be able to proceed forward. And as we look at large complex organizations and we look at how do you drive agility in the core, these are the type of mechanisms that we're beginning to leverage. So in summary, crafting development connections means, cultivating these pockets of experimentation, these two pizza teams on the edges, protecting the boundaries of these groups, which I haven't talked enough about, so that they can move fast and they don't have a lot of people invading them and slowing them down, and then fostering social cohesion within these small teams so that everybody knows what everybody else is doing and they can complement each other and fill in the gaps. But as I said earlier, that's not enough. You also need to energize the organization. And I usually ask the question, who is this person? And I go on to say that as people answer, you wouldn't be so outraged if you thought this was a rock star, but if you thought that in fact this was the CEO of a company that was standing up in front of 16,000 people at Yellow Dragon Stadium in China, his name being Jack Ma, or more affectionately known as Crazy Jack Ma, you might think it's even more bizarre. And what Jack Ma was doing in this particular instance was he was standing up in front of the Alibaba employees, trying to convince them that they could be the crocodile in the river and they could beat eBay at eBay's own game in China, but if they went out into the ocean, that the shark would eat them. And the shark in this case being eBay. And what he knew was that his employees in the infancy of Alibaba didn't have the intellectual capital that eBay had at that point in time, did not have the technological resources that eBay had at that time. But what they did have, or what they could have, was the energy and the spirit to really charge forward and move fast and iterate and test. And the only way they could do that is if Jack Ma and his leadership team challenged them and continued to energize them to try more bold things. And that's exactly what he did. You know the rest of the story. And succinctly stated, energy is contagious. This is data of people entering into an organization across, a different tenure, the time horizon being on the bottom. And as people enter in, you can see that in this particular case, engagement drops, but those people that are dropped into disengaged teams or de-energized teams, actually drop far more quickly than those who are dropped in more engaged teams. So energy is in fact contagious, and negative energy will suck the life out of you in this particular instance at a 3x level. But the same is also true with positive energy. This is a network of 750 people. And just by using some simple algorithms of, who are the super energizers and how much energy they can buzz up and create and echo across the network, you're able to discover just two people in a 750 person network are able to light up 23% of that network. In other words, energizers, remember what I said before, are able to take other people's ideas and really, truly share them in such a way that they energize other people around them. They help other people to believe in something bigger than themselves. And in order to do, the reason that's so critical is because they are able to help diffuse things more radically and more quickly than what you can do without them. One of the ways we have done that here is by creating what we call tipping forward events. In this case, once a year, we open up an auditorium. We bring people in who've worked on things from some of the earlier activities, like the summits and the collabs that I shared with before. They now have prototypes and tangible products, tangible ideas. It could be anything from apps to, different concepts that they have around, how to onboard employees, or it could be something on a vehicle. And these people, come into an auditorium and using simple Pechakuchu methods, which is they each have 20 seconds and 20 slides, 20 seconds apiece on automation, sort of click through, and they share their stories, their prototypes. And what they're really doing is they're shopping them. In the audience is a group of energizers. That group of energizers are acting to seed the network to get these ideas diffused more radically, more quickly across an organization. And by creating simple mechanisms, and this doesn't always work, and people have to buy into the ideas, you can create different social arrangements to really echo out across the network in such a way that more people buy into it And the other alternative, of course, that you heard me talk about before, is the lone inventor phenomenon, where the person just rages against the system that doesn't buy into their brilliant idea. Or you can energize the system and seed the network. So to create these diffusion connections, in summary, you need to provide space for energizers. You need to leverage the reputation of an energizer, which attracts other people. And then ultimately, you need to help diffuse these things beyond the local pockets where they can have a bigger impact. So the final connection I want to talk about before I conclude here is what we call disruption connections. And disruption connections can be best represented in what we know from Jeff Bezos. You've got to be bold and push through boundaries. You've got to tolerate some criticism if you really want to do something disruptive. I oftentimes say you can't have breakthroughs if there's nothing to break through. And where disruption connections become critical to an organization. This is where you challenge the status quo through all those other things that have happened up until this point. And then you find your way back onto the supertanker to formally endorse this idea in such a way that it can be pulled forward. And perhaps the best illustration I have of this one is one of the things we've done here with luxury transportation. So this is a small group, a two-pizza team that was actually cross-functional, cross-regional, that was interested in the luxury experience for the next generation. More specifically, they were interested in what is it that this new emergent generation is interested in from a luxury standpoint. What they discovered, going out and looking at lots of luxury experiences, was really quite simple. And that is that this generation wants access to luxury, and we found out since that this is true even beyond a generation, wants access to luxury without necessarily having to own it. So from that particular discovery, using design thinking, but ultimately tapping into the power of this small cross-functional team that acted a lot like that disbanded group of innovators I showed you on the very first couple slides, earlier in the presentation, were able to disrupt and create an entirely new product called Booked by Cadillac. Booked by Cadillac, quite simply stated, is a subscription service to the brand of Cadillac that provides access to a multitude of different vehicles on a month-to-month subscription basis. So for a single price, you get to have access to a fleet of vehicles, and you can have an Escalade as your primary vehicle and exchange that for a CT5 or whatever other vehicle you're looking for, depending on your need at any given point in time. And that particular product, where we were testing it in beta form only, where we had 50 beta tests or 50 customers for beta tests, ended up getting a backlog of 8,000 people signing up, almost overnight, because in fact, it seems to be something that resonates with consumers today. So in summary, if you want to be disruptive, you've got to start thinking about how do you break through the social bubble. You've got to start thinking about how do we break down, these brick walls that exist in organizations. And the way you do that, the way we have done that, the way we have looked at this in the research, is simply by seeding the network. And if you're this white dot, for example, in this particular case, and you want to get to the decision makers who are inside that bubble, that leadership bubble in this particular diagram, the worst thing to do is to go invite yourself into the circle. Because what you're trying to do is stand up a new idea and most likely develop social capital at the same point in time. And I oftentimes talk about Steve Saxon, who invented the digital camera at Kodak, when I share this story. And what we know about that story retrospectively is when Steve shared it with his local band of researchers, their immediate response was, "That's so cool." But then he had the opportunity to share it with the management team, and their immediate response was, "Isn't that cute?" But we make physical film, and this is not something that will disrupt us for the next decade plus. He would have been much better off, as we are today, to seed his network, get people around him buzzed up, and find the few people inside the bubble that can represent him and his idea that will ultimately pull him through the social bubble. And that's what we call disruptive connections. This is why it's so critical to get your community, your network engaged in innovations. And this is why the lone inventor simply does not work inside of corporations. So succinctly stated, I hope, in a different network illustration is, you need these development connections. You need these small pockets of activity that are happening on the fringe of a network. Here are two growth bets, development connections of, smaller groups of two pizza teams as they're divided out. The green dots are the core of this particular organization, but that's never enough. You need to get out and discover. You can use design thinking. You can use internal bridge connections to do that. You've got to discover these ideas to pull them back into those small, two pizza teams so that they can be rapidly iterated on and developed. But that's not enough. You ultimately need to bridge these and diffuse them by tapping into the energizers and brokers to pull them back into an organization. And then ultimately that leads to disruption by pulling things back into the super tankers and creating a new set of possibilities. To summarize this whole thing, and then to conclude, you need 4 different sets of connections. Those 4 different sets of connections require more brokers to be able to help discovery, more connectors to be able to help in leverage development, more energizers to help with diffusion, and then ultimately more challengers to help disrupt and pull these things into the formal systems of an organization. This is where leadership is essential to this. Up until now, much of this can happen organically, and you can just tap into the power of the network that exists inside of organizations. And this is what we describe now as adaptive space. And in the era of disruption, we think these 4 sets of connections or social arrangements are essential in driving agility.